Welcome, everybody, to today's Acronis virtual conference, Building OT Cyber Resilience in an Evolving Regulatory Environment. I'm your host, James Slaby. I'm the Director of Cyber Protection at Acronis. I've been an industry analyst covering cybersecurity and networking, and then also working with vendors in those spaces for a long time. Check out my LinkedIn profile if you want to know more about my background. We are recording today's event, and we will send you a link to the recording that you can share with colleagues who couldn't attend. Your microphones will be muted throughout the event, but we are very interested in your questions. We've got a live Q&A session with a very impressive panel of industry experts a little bit later in the event, and I would love to be able to put your questions to them live. So submit those through the Zoom Q&A interface at any point during the event. All right, I want to run a quick poll here, which is basically about what causes most downtime in your environment. So hopefully you can see that. And basically, I'm kind of curious to get a temperature read on the audience of what causes most of your downtime. Is it scheduled maintenance? Are hardware failures the main cause? You're dealing with software issues, cybersecurity incidents? Don't know. All right, I'm going to leave that up for a minute while I review the agenda here. Our first speaker is Ed Amoroso. He's the CEO of TAG InfoSphere, which has a specialty practice in operational technology. He's going to discuss his latest research into OT security and resilience issues in those environments. I'm then going to add a couple of other distinguished speakers to our panel, Chris Radabaugh of Emerson and my colleague Ryan Davis of Acronis. And we're going to spend a good half an hour talking OT cyber resilience and compliance issues. After the panel discussion, we're going to take a very brief look, with the help of my colleague JD Perham, at how Acronis addresses some of the issues that we raise in the course of the event. Then I'm going to bring the panel back to take your questions live. So again, please submit those through the Zoom Q&A interface, not the chat, throughout the event. After we take some audience questions, I'll wrap up with a few pointers to some additional reading that you might find interesting. All right, let's take a look at the poll results. All right, so some interesting results here. Fully 30% of your downtime is due to scheduled events. Software issues in the lead with 37% of respondents saying that that's the source of most of your downtime. Hardware failure and cyber attacks, malware incidents tied for 11th, and about 11% not really certain. So, all right, interesting, a little bit of information on what's bothering people these days. All right, let's jump right into the event here. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Edward G. Amoroso. Ed's one of the most impressive cybersecurity analysts I've ever met, and I've met and worked directly with a bunch of them. He's the founder and CEO of TAG InfoSphere, which is a research and advisory firm focused on cybersecurity, AI, and climate science. Before founding TAG, Ed spent over 30 years at AT&T serving as its first chief information security officer. He's also a research professor at NYU and a former advisor to the NSA and multiple U.S. presidential administrations. He's authored 6 books, holds 10 cybersecurity patents, and was named one of Business Insider's top 50 cybersecurity leaders. Phew. Welcome, Ed.
James, thanks for including me today. I'm looking forward to this.
So glad to have you, Ben.
Well, why don't we get started? So, I spent some very nice time recently working on a research report on the capabilities that Acronis offers. Very impressive capability, particularly in resilience, backup, and so on. I've always been a long admirer. I hope you'll all take some time to read the research. I think it's something that will help. But what I've learned is that the real issue when we're working with security professionals is how you integrate resilience and security. You know how there's that collision now where we ask, kind of what's the difference? Like, what is resilience? What's security? How do they go together? So I thought we'd have some fun. We only have a few minutes here before we do our panel. And I'll give you an idea of kind of the types of things I've been doing with reports like this, where I try to help people integrate, cybersecurity with resilience. So let's look at our first chart, and I'll show you a little drawing. I made a little box things, what I guess what analysts do, but I used to do them when I was a practitioner too. I thought, what does it mean to be resilient, non-resilient? And obviously, when you read the research that we did, or if you're familiar with Acronis, you know all the ways that they ensure that you've got uptime and you've got backup and you've got this basic support for resilience. And then I looked at what I think is one of the more important aspects architecturally and what we do in security, and that's zero trust. I made the grid. Now click on the first button here, and you'll see if you're really not zero trust, meaning traditional perimeter, then the only way you're ever going to be resilient is if your perimeter works. The problem is, if you click on the next chart here, it usually doesn't work. So you get a little bit of a problem there. If you're relying on your perimeter for resilience, you are going to have an issue. There's just no question. So we click on the next button, you'll see there for zero trust, click on there. That essentially is what we mean when we say zero trust. We mean very strong distributed protection, whether you're doing microsegmentation or if you architecturally set yourself up to not be dependent on a perimeter. Then I've noticed that has its own sort of resilience aspect that goes very nicely with the kinds of things that I learned about and really digging into the Acronis solution. So if you're doing Acronis and zero trust, they go together well. But if you click on the next chart, I couldn't really find examples. I thought, can I find an example where you've done zero trust properly and you're not resilient? I mean, certainly if you have no backup, I guess that would be an issue, but most people have been doing this. Now, these little boxes work out nicely when I'm talking to practitioners and so on. Click on the next chart, but a lot of them will, you can go to the next one. A lot of them will point to, click one more time, to NIST, like the definitions like this. I have to be honest, I kind of struggle with definitions like this, like adapting to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks. I guess they work, but they're not useful when you're talking to executives about this topic. So click on that, and I'll give you a couple of example non-technical analogies that I've been using when I'm talking to executives about capabilities like Acronis in the context of zero trust. So click once more, please. And this is a dumb one, but it seems to work. Like, when the heating doesn't work in your home, you put a coat on. It sort of reminds me of this idea of resilience, meaning, I'm not relying on the home. I've got my coat on, like from outside or inside. I've noticed that this works with boards. I mean, I hope there's no board members listening now because I'm actually taking a little swipe at their technical capability, but just the insight here of being resilient by having multiple layers, and certainly all the things that Acronis does are part of that whole idea. If something goes wrong, you're still able to function. Click once more and I'll show you an astronaut. So this is like, it's the same thing. Remember that movie with Sandra Bullock where the gravity, where the spaceship gets hit by all the debris? Everybody inside the spaceship dies, but her and George Clooney are out floating around in their spacesuits and they're okay. Also a very clear demonstration of resilience, this idea that if this thing you're dependent on, an enclosure, a perimeter, if that dies, what happens? And that's really that lends to the report we did on Acronis, this idea that if you're losing things, you got a problem, you got an operational problem. And in OT, we're seeing now that the kinds of attacks that we saw, like the early attack we saw with Stuxnet in 2010, that's not the last time we're going to see Stuxnet. So we've got to be very mindful of how we up both the security and resilience game in OT. I think that both a combination of what we see with Acronis, with their platform, and also a zero trust OT architecture is going to be the next big thing. Let's click one more and I'll show you something this is more in our wheelhouse. Like here, you've got PCs inside a perimeter. If the perimeter doesn't work, you better have something that does. And that's where resilience and security kind of come together. I think that's where the tire hits the road. This idea that if you've got this interplay between the protections that we've become very comfortable with in cyber, the kinds of things that a CISO is making investments in. When you combine that with the types of things we see in BCDR and in traditional industrial control and OT, you put that all together, I think that's the definition of cyber resilience. Like, it's the best one that I can come up with, that's for sure. And I've thought a lot about this and certainly have looked very carefully at the definitions that have popped out of places like NIST and others. If you click once more, you can see that NIST has a nice definition of zero trust. I almost wish that we were combining the two. You know what I mean? Like this idea that if there was some way for zero trust and that earlier definition I showed you of resilience, if we could combine that. I don't know what the right word is. Maybe it's cyber resilience. It's hard to say, but I hope you'll be mindful of the fact that as you're working with Acronis and you're doing backups and recovery and resilience, and then you sort of flip the page and you think about cybersecurity around authentication and around cyber defense and around architecture and around identity. This is the landscape that we think about in cyber. You put that into an OT environment, and I think you got to make them all work together. I mean, I hope if there's one message that I would deliver in advance of, I hope you're reading the research that we did. It's that we've got to integrate that cyber resilience can't be this thing, or resilience can't be this thing you do separately from what we do in cyber. One group that I think kind of gets it, that has sort of impressed me, if you click to my last chart here, I think that over in the EU, they've done a nice job here. As I've read through like the EU Cyber Resilience Act, I suspect that the kinds of things that you see with Acronis, and also the kinds of things that we see from our full collage of cybersecurity vendors, both for IT and OT, it really does come together very nicely in that in this OT consistent kind of cyber resilience act. That's more about products and services, but I really like it. I would recommend that you take some time looking at what the EU has done. So looking very much forward to our discussion. I hope you'll read the research. I didn't want to just kind of, spit out what we did in the research. You can go read that. But the idea of combining research like that with the day-to-day work we do both in security and in OT, I hope that's what you'll take away, that we need to integrate and combine things when we are in a practitioner mode trying to stop threats. So I'm going to turn it back to James and the team here. I'll be around for the panel, and thanks for joining our session today. I'm looking very much forward to it. So James, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Ed. I know our EU attendees will be pleased to hear that their standards people are doing things right. Ed will be off screen for a little bit, but he should be right back here because it's time for our panel discussion. Let me start by introducing our second panelist here. That's Chris Radabaugh of Emerson. He's the Lifecycle Services Program Manager at Emerson, where he leads initiatives to advance cloud-based engineering and simulation technologies. He's instrumental in the development and deployment of Emerson's Delta V Simulation Cloud, a platform designed to provide secure, globally accessible training and engineering environments for industries such as oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals. Chris advocates for the adoption of cloud solutions to enhance operational efficiency, reduce risks, and streamline training processes in industrial settings. He holds an MBA from the University of Texas at Dallas and is based in Austin, Texas. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me here today. Excited to discuss resilience with the panel.
Grateful to have your depth and experience across a range of industries here. Really happy you were able to join us. All right. Our third panelist is my colleague, Ryan Davis. He's the Senior Director of Enterprise and OEM Partnerships at Acronis. He's got over a decade of experience in storage and data management. He's got an entire team that's helping our enterprise customers improve business continuity and security in historically difficult environments like edge computing, endpoint protection, industrial automation, and research and development labs. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, James. Happy to be here and honored to be amongst our esteemed colleagues with Chris and Ed.
And Ed, if you could, thanks. Well, we want you back on this too. All right, guys, I'm going to keep the questions fairly general because I know you've got many years of experience across a range of operational technology environments. So let me start by kind of focusing on maintaining production uptime. You saw the poll that I asked of our attendees earlier. There's a fair amount of concern around software issues and so forth. But I'm curious to get your perspective on what you think are kind of the key current challenges in 2025 facing our OT leader attendees in the audience in maintaining production uptime. Chris, you're coming from the automation industry. Maybe I can ask you to start here.
Sure. Thanks, James. So, there are a lot of challenges that OT operators are facing in terms of resilience, and I think one key aspect of this is to kind of look at just a little bit of history before we jump into the current day problems and how did we get here. Automated manufacturing 100 years ago was a bunch of people standing in line, perhaps assembling a car. And over time, these persons were replaced by equipment, and equipment was then digitized. So you had this business segment that was used to producing things and monitoring their outputs, concerned with that aspect of their business. Now suddenly you're bringing in information technology. And that has brought in a new area, a new surface, if you will, for bad actors to affect your manufacturing process. So I think, kind of understanding, educating yourself, being able to assess where you're at in terms of the cyber landscape, and putting together a plan is definitely one of the first tasks that OT leaders need to consider when putting together their production environments, especially if it's been connected to outside systems.
Ed, particular thoughts? I know, again, you've been writing a lot of research in this area recently.
I mean, look, when you talk to the CISO in an industrial control environment, someone like Chris, Ryan with a lot of experience, what they hear from their leadership is two things. We need to focus on low cost, certainly, and delivery, production, making sure that if you're an energy company, making sure we can provide support capacity needs, or if you're a factory, getting things out. So when you talk about cybersecurity, a lot of them say, well, what's the big deal here? You're just patching computers. Why do we spend all this money on cyber? What's the big deal? And the answer is resilience. The answer is cybersecurity is different than IT security. We're not talking about just meeting compliance and updating your PCs. That's not, you got to do that, but it's a broader mission. And I think for all of us, it's important that we start to educate leadership that cyber is part of this whole mission in industrial and OT environments. It's not just patch the computers, it's ensure that we can deliver what we say we're delivering. It's a much broader, I think, relationship between the security team and the executive team. So that's a big deal, I think, in 2025 and 2026, moving toward greater recognition that resilience is really part of the security equation.
That's absolutely right. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, and just to build on the thought, the journey, right? When I started my career working in industrial automation and securing OT environments, it was almost always electrical engineers that I had worked with. And they weren't experts in OT cybersecurity. They just had the responsibility because the computers ran on electricity and they had electricity in their title, right? So when you think of the kind of the journey, the maturity progression, back then it was almost reactive, but Ed, you made the statement of having a plan, and that was going to be the number one recommendation that I say, which is to be intentional about OT, cybersecurity, and cyber resilience, right? The environment is different. You can't just patch the computers. The vendors may not support the patch that you want to apply. You may have systems out there that are so old that they're no longer having up-to-date patches. So you need an intentional framework that is designed for your OT environment that is going to include resilience, include the ability to be able to recover, as well as proactive measures from a networking and a segmentation perspective to be able to isolate the areas that are less secure and make sure that you're proactive in preventing cyber incidents. So really being intentional and being proactive about it is probably the best guidance that I could give. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, no problem. And just to kind of add on to that, this is not a one-time activity. With creating resiliency, you need to put your plan in place. You need to make sure that you're acting on that plan, that the plan is effective, that it actually produces the outcomes that you need to maintain that resiliency. But you also need to have a forward-looking direction. Where are we headed? What are we doing? What does this mean for, looking at resiliency needs in the future? Do we change our manufacturing environment? How does that impact our ability to maintain production uptime? These are all things that are critical. It's definitely a plan, and it's also a plan that needs to be continuously monitored and updated so that you're maintaining your secure stance, your resilient stance over time.
That's great stuff, guys. I want to move on to another topic here, specifically since it's in the title of the event, to talk a little bit about regulatory compliance. Obviously, OT embraces a lot of different industries that have their own specific compliance requirements. I will observe that there seems to be a fair amount of ferment in the regulatory world in the past couple of years, doubtless in response to things like the industrialization of malware production and distribution, and now the advent of AI tools, and just in general, the greater likelihood, despite our best efforts to defend our environments, that something's going to get through. So we're seeing a similar sort of new emphasis on the resilience piece that wasn't necessarily there before. And I see parallels there in the standards worlds. The NIST CSF 2.0 has more emphasis on cyber resilience than it used to have. We look at what our insurers are doing that write our cyber insurance policies. We're seeing much more stringent requirements to qualify for those cyber insurance policies based around resilience. But let me frame the topic more generally. What do you see as the key challenges facing OT leaders here in achieving regulatory compliance in 2025? Anybody jump in here?
So from an OT perspective with the automated manufacturing, what we're seeing is just trying to understand and implement the number of regulations and the complexities of these regulations. Ed talked about it, touched on it in his slide. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of mandates that have been placed on companies to conform to these regulations. With OT, you've got the IEC set of regulations, you've got NIST, you've got a whole host of different regulations that are out there. Then you have country-specific codes for countries like Oman, Germany, so on and so forth. And then you've got area specific. We're all familiar with CRA. It looks like it's going to do wonders in Europe. It looks like a very good standard. But as an automated manufacturing company, especially if you run an enterprise that manufactures in multiple world areas, how do you fit all of these regulations into a manufacturing environment and still maintain your efficiency? So we find that, understanding and being able to comply is one level, but also, looking at, okay, from your trusted manufacturers, your trusted equipment providers, your vendors, what do they have to say around this? Is there some assistance? What is good for your business? These are all very kind of actions that are pulling on one another. So it makes it very, very difficult in that regulatory environment to understand, what exactly it is that you need to do and where you are to go.
Yeah, and to add on to that, and Chris hit on it, the regulations are coming from all sides, right? That you're talking about governmental level, like the EU CRA or the NIS2 directive for Europe. And if you're in the US or if you're in Asia, if you're doing business there, you've got to understand it and make sure that you can comply with it. And then we even see vertical specific. Most people are familiar with, NERC CIP in the US. But there's others now for other industries like IACS 2627 for the maritime industry, which now says cyber resilience of systems is as important as other safety systems like life jackets and fire suppression systems on the ships, right? So you could be in an industry, even if you're in a country that does not have one of these regulations, but you still got to comply. And so clearly, that's going to require increased investment in solutions, as things like NIS2 are requiring, backup, risk management, vulnerability assessment, incident disclosures. So you're going to need a whole compliance framework to make sure that you comply, and you're also going to have to invest in the tools to allow you to become compliant. And what we're seeing is most organizations' budgets are not rising at a level that meets the rising regulatory pressures. And so what I am seeing with a lot of our customers that are more forward thinking is they're taking a very close look at how they are doing things and their existing spend in order to reallocate and optimize investments to be able to meet their new obligations. So I'll give some simple examples. We talked about a little bit Purdue model, network segmentation, or Ed talked about the secure perimeter, right? That's the old way of just building a moat around OT and keeping everything else out, which doesn't really work in the modern smart factory industry 4.0 era. But there's a lot of carryover from that generation in terms of how solutions are implemented and managed within OT. Like a lot of solutions are managed at an individual site level. So each location or even lines within a location have their own instances of each application, right? Whether backup, AV, monitoring, all of it, right? So if you have even mid-sized organizations that might have handful of locations, they may have tens or dozens of instances of application servers performing the same job, just at different locations. They don't even think about it. That's just how it's always done. But when you look at your cost of hosting that redundant infrastructure, you're spending a lot. You're spending a lot on overhead, the FTE, managing those solutions. And so forward-looking organizations are looking at that and saying, you know what, if we can consolidate this down, whether we have like global management layers or even regional, where instead of one at each site, and I've got 20 sites, so I've got 20 servers, I've got 3, that's significant costs that they can reclaim. So it's really important for the organizations to understand how the different pieces of their security stack actually incur cost on the organization. It's not just licensing, it's the infrastructure that they're spending, it's the overhead managing it. And they can, if you're able to gather those metrics properly by optimizing how you're doing things, consolidating, whether it's vendors or just even on the same vendor, consolidating infrastructure, you can then repurpose that money to make the investments needed to become more compliant. And that's something that we're seeing, again, with forward-looking organizations. And I think that's going to start becoming the standard going forward.
Ed, do you want to chime in on this before we move on?
Ryan and Chris had some great points there. I'll try and build on it. I guess I have 2 things I'd like to say about the regulatory issues in OT around these topics. First is there is a difference between regulations and regulators. So when you read NERC CIP or you read, they're really fine documents. In fact, I think you probably could just take NIST and apply it to OT. It'd be the same thing. I mean, NERC CIP is not that much different. They just instantiate referencing specific components, but you could do that in an appendix to NIST. So we probably should have done that, but whatever. The regulators, however, grew up in an environment where safety was the primary control. And there's a big difference between do these 10 things to stay alive in a factory. And here's how you stop a nation state from bringing the whole place down. Completely different. So that's a problem. I think that maybe the next generation of regulators will grow up with a little bit more savviness around cyber. But my experience in dealing with regulators in this industry, some of them are a little old fashioned and a little befuddled by all of the cyber stuff. So that's the first thing I would say. I think the second is around this legacy problem that we have in, I grew up in telecom, so I feel very connected emotionally to OT engineers because like if you work in telecom, you know, that old circuit switch thing that your grandmother still uses, that has to stay up. So there's nobody using it. It went from 90 million access lines 10 years ago to 5 million in the US or less, but the infrastructure has to stay up. So when there's regulatory controls that are modern and that you're designing for mobility and for 6G and for, you know, software defined infrastructure, how do you do that for these old, electronic switching systems built 60 years ago? And in OT, it's the same thing, right? You have these old SCADA things. They're going to be there. And it's like, all right, the regulatory environment says you got to do A, B, and C. They line up very nicely with the things you're designing, you know, automated, autonomous, more sustainable kind of infrastructure. Yeah, go team. That stuff lines up well. But the old crap you have, what do? All you do is just have a whole book full of exceptions. So it's a weird time when you're retiring old and bringing in new. And again, the regulators, I think when they look at all of us doing cyber, I think they just think we're all nuts. They don't understand this. That'll come with, this is going to sound a little crude, but it'll come with the actuarial tables. You know, as you get younger, regulators who get this, grew up with it, it'll just be easier.
As the gray-haired guy in the room, I hate to hear that, but it's actually a great segue to my next topic here, which is about the skills issues of building resilience and compliance in these environments. You know, Ed, you talked about the sort of culture clash. I know it really struck me the first time I dived in from pure enterprise IT and networking and security into the telecom world. And I am likewise reminded of that again as I learn more about OT, is just the life cycle differences between OT and IT and the difficulty that kind of classic enterprise IT folks sometimes have grasping the challenges with this, what we call legacy gear, which is actually, a little pejorative. I think it's like, it's still around, it's still working. We've got 10 more years to amortize of life out of it. And you're talking about patching on a kind of an hourly basis. That just doesn't, that kind of stuff doesn't fly. So that leads me into a question about how you manage the skills environment, particularly as we get to broader adoption of Industry 4.0 and this greater convergence of OT and IT. How do you manage the challenges of getting the right skills and bringing in the new skills that you need to manage these newly converged environments and the sort of not just technology challenges, but the cultural challenges, the people challenges in that world?
Ed, you want to comment on that? I thought your
I
points
certainly
about,
can. I mean,
all right, yeah.
I'm paid to be a little provocative, so I will be. But I bet half the people listening here are involved in some sort of convergence strategy where you converge IT and OT and put them together. What happens is half the room is a bunch of 50-somethings drinking their coffee out of styrofoam cups, wearing windbreakers. The other half of the room is 20-somethings with their laptops drinking lattes from Starbucks, and they look at each other and they don't understand each other. You can't create a converged environment by just forcing them in the room. I think it just happens, sadly, for maybe some of the older engineers. The new OT infrastructure looks like pretty modern cloud connected zero trust stuff, running operating systems with an IP stack. I think like I'm biased because I'm an internet person, but I think IT eats all of this. And you'll see devices that start to look very much like, the normal kind of IoT things that we put on a network, as opposed to these proprietary SCADA controlled out of band things. Those are going to go away. Now it'll take time, but I think my advice for leadership is to be patient. I don't think you force cultural integration when it's not comfortable. I think you just, sadly, this is my advice, you just have to let it happen naturally. And I think the technology will drive that.
Yeah, and I think with another bit of advice is that given the skills gap that we have, or the market for cyber professionals, given that they are largely in the IT space, be wary of fly by night offers by so-called cybersecurity specialists and consulting companies that they realize there's a market need there. There's a lot of activity. There's certainly a lot of fear in some instances that companies are not cyber secure enough. And they've come in and they will certainly look at your system, write you a report, and tell you what to do. And I've seen some of these reports, and my question is always, is this really useful to you? It looks somewhat boilerplate and doesn't really deal with some of the specifics. Every manufacturing environment is a little bit unique. And so what we try to encourage with our customers is not, don't go get outside opinions or anything like that. That's silly. But work closely with your vendors and try to understand, what sort of security and resilience mechanisms do they have already in their products? What do they recommend from an architectural standpoint? How can we collaborate together and make sure that you're on the path to doing something that's best for your business, not necessarily just best for the current situation.
Yeah. And in terms of the skills gap and the IT/OT integration, we see various levels of success with that. But we often sometimes see the gap being cascading whatever you want to do from that convergence perspective to the actual endpoint, right? Because that typically requires the actual automation, the manufacturing, the process control engineer. And so on that, coming back to the first thing I said, be intentional, be purposeful, identifying dedicated tools for this is important, right? There is going to be a difference in terms of the technical acumen, the capabilities of that person that needs to apply the change on the endpoint in a manufacturing facility than someone doing it on the data center. So you may need, and you likely need, different tools for the same purpose, because the environments are different. They're being managed by different people. For the short Acronis sales pitch, this is why we develop capabilities like one-click restore, which the top, I think, thing that caused downtime was software incidents, right? Software issues, blue screens. Being able to recover with one touch doesn't require an IT expert. So we're doing things to try and develop the solution to fit the OT environment. And so identifying tools that are going to serve the function, but also be usable by the people that you have managing the environment is what's going to be most important. And then to Chris's advice, where you have skills gap, leveraging your key strategic suppliers, whether it's the OEMs, the actual automation manufacturers like Emerson, or trusted system integrators that are in the field, not people building new practices, but actually have the experience, we find very important.
Yeah, and to that, before we get off this topic, just one more comment.
Sure.
We're looking at the issues with the environment, the skills, and so forth. It certainly is. It's a journey. It's people, processes, and technology that really kind of combine together to really provide for a resilient system. And I think you need to be sure that you're covering all of those bases, because if you're not, you may find yourself in an unfortunate situation.
All right, gents. I wish we had another half hour here because I have a bunch more questions, but we're going to need to move on. I'm going to need you back in about 10 minutes, so don't stray too far. But right now, I'd like to hand the stage over to my colleague, JD Perham, who's going to give a very brief tour of Acronis's approach to dealing with some of the questions that we've talked about here today. JD Perham, who will conduct this tour, is one of our superstar solutions architects. He's been with Acronis for nearly 13 years, and he's focused on helping our enterprise customers in manufacturing and industry, as well as our many partners in the automation world, to build resilient, highly secure operational technology environments, industrial control system environments. Over to you, JD.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Let me go ahead and get this shared out. We'll run through this. We've only got 10 minutes, so it's going to be kind of a little rapid fire here, but figured we'd start with the management server component, right? So Acronis still has a completely on-premise solution. We do offer a cloud solution if you'd like it as well, if you're that modern thinking, but most of our customers are going to be taking our on-premise solution. So, and with that, we have a management server. You could kind of think of that as the control layer for everything that we're doing. We're a little bit different in that once we've set up the control, things get distributed out to the endpoint. So the endpoints themselves take care of running their own backups, starting their own backups, communicating with the storage. The management server really is used for orchestration and then reporting kind of capabilities. So building off what Ryan said, right? How we may see folks start with, hey, I've got a single machine. Our management server can absolutely run on a single machine with that agent on it, doing everything kind of locally. You can take the crawl, walk, run approach where, hey, maybe now we move up to doing an entire line, or maybe we move up to doing an entire site or an entire region. The management server can grow with you in that aspect, right? So if we look at the top here, right, and I've already got this kind of set up, you can see I've got different layers here. So this is completely multi-tenant, meaning that, the QA line here from Mount Vernon wouldn't be able to see what's inside of line 2 or line 1. So that's giving that separation of duties, right? Breaking out who's controlling these specific machines that you want. From an organizational level, though, if I come into my devices and I look at, for example, my machines with agents on them, I'll be able to see exactly what's happening in the environment, right? I can see all the specific details, regardless of what the workload is. So one of the key strengths here is, again, keeping it kind of simple, right? So regardless of whether it's a Linux machine or a Windows 10 or something running a SQL database, we're going to have that same capability. Starting with protecting these assets, though, is all going to be about our protection plan. So if I come in and select a machine here, for example, and I come in and hit protect, this is going to pull me in and show me the protection plans that are already assigned to this device. So it takes it a second because it's querying the device to kind of pull up what's on that plan there. But then this allows us to go through and see all of the different aspects that Acronis can cover for you. Almost everyone knows this for our backup and restore. So if we open this guy up, right, I can see I'm doing Acronis's disk imaging technology, our entire machine. I'm backing that up off to a network share in this case. But building on that resiliency, you don't want your backups just all in one basket, right? So in this case, I'm replicating it automatically out to Acronis's cloud storage. This could be any kind of storage target that Acronis supports. So you could be going off to a public cloud. You could be going to another NAS device. We can also separate this out where different agents are doing this replication, so it's not tied to the one individual machine. But this gives you that capability of really building out those 3-2-1s of backups that everyone knows about, right? Having your running data with 2 copies in 2 different formats, one of them being completely off-site. Drilling even further down into this, right? Acronis has a full stack antivirus, anti-malware capability that runs directly from the same agent. So reducing that agent sprawl that you would see on those different devices. Vulnerability assessments and patch management, right? We have ways of building all of these things in so that they work in what's typically a segregated, OT type environment. As it slowly marches forward, we can grow and change with you. Now that I've got my simple backup kind of set up, right? You can see I've ran this. It runs every Monday through Friday at 2 a.m. How do I get a machine back up and running, right? And that's all going to be dependent on what your failure modes are, right? So in this case, that machine's still up, right? Maybe I had a bad patch and I just need to roll this machine back. Well, in that case, it's as simple as coming into my recovery tab. Here at the top, I'll be able to see where my different storage locations are. So there's my NAS location, there's off to the Acronis cloud. If I look here at the bottom, this is then going to tell me, hey, here are all my recovery points. As a technician, I don't have to start with, I need to go and restore that full backup first, and then I got to layer on all these incrementals. Acronis does all of that work for you underneath the hood. So if I simply need to roll the machine back, let's say I wanted to go back to yesterday, I would simply come in and hit recover, hit entire machine. That then will prompt me for the credentials for my storage location. In this case, since we're coming off of a NAS, so I'll throw in my credentials here. And then what's going to happen is it's going to map everything out for me. So it knows what's inside of the backup. It's looking at what's inside of that machine. I can see I've got one disk in this machine. It's automatically mapping it back to disk one. If I needed to, you can get into the weeds in this. You can drill down. I can come in and say, hey, I only want to recover the C volume and not do the entire thing. But we always kind of start you with the easy option, meaning let's go disk one to disk one here. You may be seeing a safe recovery option. This is something that where we go a little bit further, where we've got integration between our backup and antivirus capability. Safe recovery is hey, maybe it was a ransomware event that I'm trying to roll back from. Now you're concerned, hey, are the backups infected? Is there a logic bomb sitting there waiting for a restore to happen that's then just going to re-encrypt that machine as soon as I bring it back up? Safe recovery is your answer for that. That allows us to go through and actually scan the backup before we lay it down onto the system for any known ransomware signatures or definitions that we may have. So it's using our definition engine that we have, scans it on a file by file basis. If we do discover something, then we'll go through and automatically rip that out. You'll notice if I go back one layer, these all have little gray dots on it. We can do that scanning ahead of time. So instead of having to wait to do it as part of recovery, if I simply come over to my plans tab here, you can see I've got backup scanning capability here. I can simply say, hey, let's go ahead on, in this case, I built out a schedule on it. Every Thursday and Sunday at 9 a.m., I want to scan specific backups that are in this location, right? And I'm telling it what machine's doing that work because we have that capability of pushing off workloads, right? Because we're always concerned of going back to like, hey, what do we do with this legacy type system, right? Maybe it's just barely enough that we can back it up. Well, I don't want to be doing scans off of that type of a machine. So this gives us that, we call it off-host data processing, the capability of taking something more performant or even maybe something that's not involved in production to do these kind of a scan. Now that covers, one of those kind of like I say, a failure scenario, right? But what happens if I just want to do some testing? Well, if I come back in and look at this recovery point here, you may notice that we have this run as a VM option. This gives us the capability to leverage an existing Hyper-V or a VMware host to go ahead and take the backup file and spin it up as a VM. Completely isolated, you can segregate it out via the network. So if I come in and click on this, it's going to ask me what host do I want to go to, what my VM settings are, and in the VM settings, you can actually pull all of this out. This gives you an easy option to say test your recovery options, right? Can I actually get a machine back up and running from my backup, right? And we're using a VM here to check it. But if I come in here and I'll just give this a quick VM name here just so I can identify it, what it's doing now is it's talking to that specific host that I selected. It's going to go through and grab information from that host. So it's talking to it right now. It's trying to figure out what data stores it has, things of that nature. But once I have this kind of capability on, I can go ahead and hit run now, and that will go through and spin up that VM for me. I can then go in and make sure that it recovered, or maybe I want to open it up to a different vulnerability tool, right? Maybe I have a third-party solution or our security team wants to have access to the machines. Well, we don't want to give them full access to a running production environment because what happens if they break it? Cool. I can give you a complete block-by-block clone of that machine that you can then spin up in an isolated environment. Production stays as it is. You can give me your report when you're finished on what you think we need to do as far as patching or those kind of capabilities that then I can check with my vendors and make sure that we're able to apply that. And all of this is done without even touching that machine. So that's another capability of restoration. But Ryan also mentioned, hey, what happens with that blue screen kind of capability? He brought up that one-click restore. I've kind of jumped a little bit here, and I've got a machine that I've already kind of rebooted, so we don't have to wait for Windows to reboot. But this is what our one-click recovery menu looks like. So on that machine, we're going to have pre-scripted recovery tasks. So if in that case of where I'm backing up to my NAS device, we've built everything into this recovery option where if I was to just simply come in and say, hey, let's recover this from the latest backup, it automatically knows where that backup is located at because it's built into that script as it ran the backup. This is all stored locally on the device, so I can simply come in and say, hey, recover this machine from the latest backup. Or maybe I need to go back a little bit further because I did discover ransomware and I don't trust the latest backup. Maybe I want to go back a week or 2 weeks because that's when our indicators of compromise kind of are pointing to us when we were clear. Well, I can simply select which backup I want to recover, or I can say perform it manually. That gets me into our normal bootable media. If you've ever used Acronis before, it's a pretty simple process, but this, obviously, you can point to different storage locations or pull in different images from inside of here. So as I mentioned, we didn't have a ton of time here. We're kind of right at that edge. We can absolutely walk through in greater detail any of this if you guys would like. We're going to ask you how you want to be contacted. So if you guys want to get a deeper dive and get into a deeper demo, we can absolutely do that. But at this point, James, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much for the whirlwind tour there, JD. As JD mentioned, you will have an opportunity to reach out to us if you want a more detailed kind of walkthrough. There's a ton more functionality there, specific OT environments that we didn't want to get to keep to time here. All right, with that, I want to invite our panelists back. So Ed, Chris, Ryan, if you could come back on. JD is going to help us off stage, as well as another of our solutions engineer managers, Josh Bryant, is going to be helping backstage with some of your questions, but we wanted to take some live questions from the audience. So please, this is your chance, attendees, to get your questions in front of the panel via the Zoom Q&A interface. I've got an excellent one to kick us off here. For some reason, my camera doesn't want to come back on, but you don't need me on screen. Oh, there I am. This is a question I would have put to the panel during the panel discussion if I could have, but so it's really on point. Ernest, attendee, asks, while our main topic today is the regulatory environment, I was wondering if the panel could also offer some insights into the challenges posed by AI-generated cyber attacks and what strategies organizations should adopt to stay secure and resilient. Yeah, that's clearly one of the hot button topics in cybersecurity, and it's as applicable to OT environments as it is to enterprise IT. What do you see? How do you see AI modifying the attack environment, how attackers are using it, and how we as defenders, builders of OT resilience might respond?
I'll give Chris and Ed
I think
first step.
just at a very high level, I think all of the cyber attacks kind of share the commonality that it's an external threat to your production environment, and you need to take measures to protect yourself against them. We're moving very slowly, at least internally in terms of how we're treating AI, but we are maintaining that resilient protective layer on the outside and working with our vendors and suppliers to really understand. So much like in the areas of just resiliency, it's understanding exactly how and what you need to do in those areas and working with your vendors to understand exactly what you need to do to thwart off those attacks. It's definitely something that as we go forward in time is rapidly increasing, the concerns in that area.
So from my side, there's a couple of pieces of advice that I would give, and trying to look at it from an Acronis lens to a degree. On one end, you of course are going to want to have the investment in the tools that are going to provide proactive protection against those sort of incidents. So whether that's as much as you can, up-to-date patches, reducing the vulnerability, proper access controls, things of that nature, right? And Acronis has tools in terms of our next-gen antivirus that are trained to detect different attacks from a security perspective, not just from a resilience perspective. But again, AI represents a risk of more industrialized ransomware, where it can write it for you and write different kind of attacks and explore your environments in different ways. And so that also emphasizes the need for a very robust resilience, reactive recovery posture. And so that's not just making sure that you do backups and having them up to date, or the 3-2-1 rule, where you'll have backup local for fast recovery and then offsite. It also would be making sure you'd have immutable or air-gapped archives that cannot be reached by ransomware. So that way, if you are impacted, and most cyber practitioners today will say it's not a matter of if anymore, it's just when and how they're going to get in, making sure that you have an ironclad recovery strategy is critical.
James, this is an area I spend probably more time on than any other AI. And my observation, dealing with a lot of clients who try to limit their AI risk by limiting their use of AI within the enterprise, and they miss the whole point that nation states are starting to use offensive AI to aim at them. And if you combine autonomous, intelligent AI with Stuxnet-like lethality, the only way you can stop it is with AI. You can't beat an AI at chess. You can't beat an AI at Go. You're not going to beat an AI at cyber. So in the next few years, sadly, for a lot of people who really cling still to human beings doing manual tasks, I think any organization that's still doing a manual task that could be automated and done autonomously is going to lose. So it's time to upgrade. Like, and I cringe when I hear organizations say, we're all this AI, we're going easy on that. I think if you go easy, you're going to get attacked. You've got to embrace the technology. You have to start automating and AI enabling your defense. I know a lot of people listening to me don't agree with that, but I believe to my core that nation state actors right now are building the capability to do things like aim a neural network at you that more or less sees your attack surface using a computer vision algorithm, neurons that just look at your attack surface and instantaneously find the problem and attack and don't stop. How are you going to stop that? You can't stop it with human beings. You have to stop it with AI. So I hope people start to wake up to that fact, because we're going to be very exposed if we don't.
Well, that's terrifying, but I think I tend to agree with you that we tend to be a little bit conservative there. Maybe if I can add a comment on a kind of a more day-to-day kind of issue, because one of the things that AI is doing is optimizing attacks that we're familiar with. So phishing attacks come at us at a much greater volume, and they're perfectly spelled and grammatically correct. But there's also new attacks like impersonations. You can get on a Zoom or a Teams call and unwittingly be talking to a bunch of AI impersonations of your senior leadership. We've seen attacks where they convinced a finance employee to wire millions to an offshore account for him to discover that he wasn't really on talking to his executives, but AI simulations of them. And this happens in real time. They can mimic your voice or mine with only about 30 seconds of audio. So it's, among other things, it means security awareness is more important than ever. And that's up and down the chain from your senior leadership on down to your OT engineers in the plant, because particularly as OT and IT converge more, those attack surfaces are going to be much wider open into that environment. And so there are steps that you can take. These are threats that you know how to deal with. You just got to get more diligent. And certainly AI in your anti-malware, your EDR is going to help deal with the optimization of AI attacks on the endpoints. All right, I think we have time for one more question before I wrap. I have a question here on NIS2 is presenting us with a bunch of new requirements to deal with from a compliance perspective. Where would you recommend we triage those efforts? What should we focus on first? Any thoughts there?
I'll give Ed or Chris an opportunity if they want to.
I mean, there are a couple of requirements in NIS2 that like shrink the time to respond. So I think in a couple of cases where things are a little tighter, just gonna have to up the game. But most of the requirements, I've done a mapping, doesn't introduce that much new, but it does tighten some things. So I think you have to go line by line through the standard, and you're probably going to be tightening things up, particularly around response times.
Yeah, incident response where you got 24 hours to do the basic warning and something like 72 hours for a more formal warning and start communicating to your partners and customers. That's going to take a little bit more revisiting of your whole incident response strategy, visiting who has communication responsibilities, who their backups are when they're on holiday, and so forth. So.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, this too introduces some accountability requirements on the organization that at the executive level that they're accountable to compliance. So, I mean, ultimately, you just have to build out the organization underneath the executive that's going to be accountable. I mean, there's legitimate penalties if you neglect it. So you just build out the organization under the leadership, and they should have the stick to be able to ensure compliance throughout the rest of the organization.
Yeah, I like to say the upside there is that it's easier to get budget for projects when failure to invest in it might land your CEO in jail. It's, approvals generally happen faster when that threat is there. All right, folks. I think that's all the time we've got. We're right at the top of the hour here, and I have just a couple more minutes of things to bring to our audience here. So I want to thank you so much, our speakers, Ed Amoroso of Tag Infosphere, Chris Radabaugh of Emerson, and my Acronis colleagues, Ryan Davis, JD Perham, and Josh Bryan. Let's go to our wrap up here. I want to run another quick poll here, which is to give our attendees the opportunity to let us know how they would like Acronis to reach out to them here. Excuse me 1 second here. There we go. All right, let us know how you'd like to reach out to us. While that runs, I want to review some resources for you real quickly here. A couple of analyst reports here, one authored by Ed Amoroso that looks at our solution and more broadly at issues of OT cyber resilience, and another one from Omdia, which is another research organization that has a OT practice that talks about our solution. Next slide, please. We now have a product page up that talks about our OT solutions more broadly for operational technology and industrial control system environments, and then another page that's specific to manufacturing. There's also a solution brief and an infographic that you might find interesting. Next slide, please. A few case studies that focus on our partners in the automation industry, as well as end user enterprises that are using Acronis to protect their environments. That's in steel production, in power generation, and pharmaceuticals, as well as our partner ABB, which is one of the global leaders in automation tech. All right, with that, I would like to say thank everybody for taking the time to visit us today. If you're a service provider, we encourage you to take a look at how the Acronis Academy can help you grow your business. With that, I'll say thanks, everybody. We hope to see you again at another Acronis event soon.